From a Justice Department sentencing memo that was filed in court last year, quote, defendant Christopher Joseph Quaglin was among the most violent of the January 6 rioters. He viciously assaulted numerous officers, and this court convicted him of 6 counts of assault, 2 counts of robbery, obstruction of the congressional certification vote, and other offenses. On at least a dozen occasions, he stood face to face with officers as he screamed at, pushed with outstretched arms, punched, swatted, and slapped officers, pushed bike racks into officers, and even choked one officer to the ground. He used his body as a battering ram and employed a stolen police riot shield against the officers in an attempt to force his way into the building. He sprayed several officers directly in the face with chemical irritant. He joined the collective mob pushes against the police line. In total, he was on Capitol grounds wreaking havoc for more than 3 hours. Due to his egregious criminal conduct on January 6th, his refusal to accept responsibility, and the need to deter him and others from further wrongdoing, the government recommends that the court sentence him to 168 months of incarceration. That sentencing memo was written by a Justice Department prosecutor whose name is Ashley Akers. And the Trump-appointed judge who heard that case and considered that memo agreed and sentenced the defendant to 12 years in prison, just shy of what the prosecutors had asked for. Now, less than a year after that, he's out. And one of the last things Ashley Akers did as a prosecutor for the U.S. Department of Justice was submit filings to dismiss charges against defendants in cases she spent years building. Dismiss the charges because these people have been now pardoned by Donald Trump. I say that's one of the last things she did for the U.S. Justice Department because after more than 7 years as a federal prosecutor and involvement in many January 6 cases, Ashley Akers left the U.S. Justice Department today. She's here tonight for her first television interview since leaving her post. Ms. Akers, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for your service.
You're welcome.
After 7 years at the Justice Department, did you want to leave?
No, I suppose yes, because I left. But the circumstances came in a way that I didn't expect.
Yeah. What is it like to have worked on so many of these January 6 cases? I understand that you may have had as many, if not more, January 6 trials as any prosecutor in the department. What is it like to have all of that work and all of those cases and all of those convictions and all of those sentences wiped away by the president?
It was appalling, really. I think that the pardons that happened were disturbing. They were disturbing for a number of reasons. They were disturbing because it condones the violence that you just described and that the prosecutors on the team have been describing for years in court. It condones that. And this wasn't ordinary violence. As you described earlier, the police officers who were testifying in trials for years talked about this being the scariest day of their lives. They didn't know if they were going to come home. They talked about this being a medieval battle scene. And not only does it condone violence against those law enforcement officers, but it undermines the rule of law. And as judges in our court have continually repeated that the cornerstone of our democracy is the peaceful transition of power from one administration to the next. And the crimes that were pardoned from January 6th were crimes that disrupted that peaceful transition of power.
The way these pardons were handed down, blanket pardons and commutations without regard to criminal records, without regard to the specific crimes that were charged here, without regard to level of violence, without regard to anything else, anything potentially differentiating about these cases. Does that increase the threat that you were talking about? The reason I ask is because I think politically it's being greeted not just as a favor to these individuals, but essentially it's being greeted as an attempted vindication of what they did, not just an erasure of any accountability for it, but in effect a celebration of what they did. Are you worried about that?
I'm worried, Rachel, because Donald Trump pardoned some very, very dangerous people. Rioters who point-blank bear sprayed officers in the face, rioters who beat police officers with a baseball bat, a hockey stick, a hammer, a chair leg protruding with nails, rioters who brought firearms to the Capitol on January 6th expecting violence, rioters who choked officers to the ground, who gouged their eyes. So I don't know what's going to happen, but is America safer today after these pardons? Certainly not.
Are you worried about FBI agents and Justice Department personnel and prosecutors such as yourself being personally targeted by the people who have just been pardoned and had their sentences commuted?
I think any prosecutor would say that that is a risk that comes with the job, and I hope not. And I hope that these people who are pardoned and given a second chance take it. But the rhetoric online, the rhetoric from these people that the president pardoned doesn't suggest that that's true. And this rhetoric has held true before January 6th, during January 6th, and after. And it's dangerous.
There are some January 6 defendants who were charged with or even convicted for other offenses, especially guns and weapons charges. People having sawed-off shotguns, unregistered AR-15s, fragmentation grenades, explosives. And some of those charges were brought not directly related to their January 6th crimes, but maybe the FBI was at their house searching and found those things because they were looking for them because of their involvement in January 6 crimes in the first place. Should we expect that people who have had secondary criminal charges, who've had other courses of criminal charges that weren't necessarily just about their behavior on January 6th, should we expect that those things are going to be in court for a long time while their lawyers try to persuade judges that the January 6th pardons also should expunge any responsibility for the other things they've been charged for?
I think, Rachel, it's not just their lawyers. It's now the Department of Justice that's asking courts to interpret this executive order, this pardon order, very broadly. For example, I have a case where two defendants were subject to pretrial supervision. One of them had an ankle monitor. He cut it off. Him and his co-defendant fled the FBI for over a month, and so they were charged with a failure to appear. Completely separate offense from January 6th conduct. They failed to appear for their court date. The Department of Justice has now interpreted that and has filed in court such, asking the court to dismiss the whole case because the very basis of it was January 6th related. So I think you can expect that this department is going to ask for an incredibly broad reading of the president's pardon.
I mean, the problem here is that means that if you committed an offense for which you pled guilty or were convicted on January 6th, that under what you just described would imply that the Justice Department under Donald Trump, their new position is that any crime that could conceivably described as derivative from something that happened on January 6th, even if it is cutting off an ankle bracelet, even if it is, harboring illegal silencers or explosives or other weapons or all these things, that people get all of those things expunged, that there's no way to prosecute them for any derivative or non-derivative crimes.
I don't know if the department's going to go that far, but the evidence that we have now, based on the filings of the department, there are two cases where the department is moving to dismiss in its entirety defendants' cases who have fled the FBI and the court's jurisdiction.
The Justice Department, people who work at the Justice Department, career staff at the department, and staffers sort of at all levels have been given a bit of a shock to the system, not just with the change in leadership this week, but also with, I think, what were some unexpected decisions, one of which related to the DOJ Honors Program. You came to DOJ in the first place through the Honors Program. Can you explain what that is and what's just happened to that program?
Yeah, it's devastating. What happened to the program was, I believe it was yesterday, all DOJ Honors hires, recent hires, were sent a somewhat crude email informing them that they were no longer going to be hired at the department, although they had already been hired. These are people who
already had an offer, already been hired.
They had forewent law firm recruiting. They haven't been interviewing. They have jobs at the Department of Justice, or at least an offer of a job. They expected, anticipated to work there. And they were told this week that they no longer should expect that. It's devastating. One of the only ways to come into the Department of Justice as a young lawyer is through the honors program. It's an incredibly prestigious program. It's hard to get in. The people who come in are very bright attorneys. And so for those attorneys, top of their class, have all the awards, have all the credentials, decided not to go to a law firm, decided not to make all the money. They wanted to be public servants, and they were hired as such. And now, unfortunately, they're going to have to find something else.
We're also seeing senior career staffers at the Justice Department, including people who have been seen as sort of the infrastructure of the department in terms of some of the most complex areas of the law work, essentially shunted into all seemingly into the same office where they're all being told they're now going to work on prosecuting sanctuary cities or something, going after local jurisdictions that have proclaimed themselves to be opposed to the administration's approach to immigration law enforcement. What do you think the impact of that will be? The intention seems to be to try to make all of those senior people quit.
That seems to be the intention. I think on the ground in this last week, what it's done is it's just terrified people. Everyone is worried if they're going to be fired or moved. If the goal was to make the department more efficient, I think this had the contrary effect. It's also, I mean, in my assessment, and I'm not part of this, but it's nonsensical. You have people who are subject matter experts in certain sections who have committed their lives to litigating certain subject matters, and to pull them and to put them in a different unrelated section where they have no experience, no involvement, probably no interest, seems contrary to the mission of the department. Yeah,
and it seems deliberately intended to both insult and wound the department in this transition period. Ms. Akers, 7 years at the Justice Department. You charged dozens of cases related to January 6th. You had 14 trials, I believe, related to January 6th. You've done a real service to the country at the Justice Department. I'm interested to see what you do next. I'm sorry you had to leave under these terms, but thank you for coming here first.
Thank you.
It's nice to meet you.